So our previous lecture covered the elements of design, and this lecture now is going to cover the principles of design. And whereas the elements are kind of an analysis where we break apart a design and look at each individual part, the principles of design are more so a synthesis where we combine things together and talk about how they fit together. So the principles are guidelines that tell us how to fit the elements together. And the four principles of design are proportion, balance, rhythm, and emphasis. So let's start with the first one, proportion. Proportion refers to how the size of one part relates to the size of another part or the whole item, and oftentimes this is expressed as a height to width ratio. And so when we're doing designs, we just want to think about proportion and make sure that the objects that are included in our design are proportional to each other. So let's say, for example, if we're coming up with a floor plan design and maybe we're doing a little sketching on a floor plan, that we want to make sure that things are proportional to each other, and as we do design, that things relate well to another. Or let's say we're coming up with some kind of graphic that's going to go in a magazine. We want to make sure as we put two parts together and we're coming up with this, that they look like they go together. Though when we're designing a graphic, we can use a lot of different techniques, some Photoshop techniques, some InDesign techniques to bring in a lot of components, but we always need to make sure that they are proportional. You know, another example that I've seen is when looking as we do like a house structure, looking how the roof relates to the rest of the structure. And sometimes you see structures where, you know, really all you see is the roof. They wanted to make such a steep pitch on the roof, but it's really out of proportion to the rest of the structure. All you see is the roof. You don't really see, you know, the floors that might be underneath it, because in comparison, that roof is so much bigger. So we want to make sure that things are in proportion when we do design. The second principle is balance. And balance refers to how elements are arranged horizontally or vertically. And our balance can be achieved by using the elements of design. We can create balance with color. We can create balance with lines and shapes and texture. And we have two types of balance. We have formal balance and informal balance. So our formal balance is where the design is equal on both sides. So like you see in the first graphic here, whereas if we were to take and draw a line down the middle, we could fold it in half and it would be exactly the same. We refer to that as symmetric. So formal balance are designs that are symmetric, whereas informal balance are where the sides are different, but there's still a balance to them. And that comes back to kind of that proportional aspect, that they're not exactly the same, but yet they're still in proportion, and therefore there's a balance to them. So like you see in the second and third graphic here, things are relatable to each other, but not exactly the same. Our third principle is rhythm, and this talks about how we use repetition in our designs to create a feeling of movement. And so we can have a standardized repetition where things are consistently exactly the same, like you see in this first graphic. We can have a slight change, like you see here, where there's a motion, there's a rhythm. Even though it's different, they still flow together. Or we can also have a rhythm that's created from rotating about a central point. And then the fourth and final principle of design is emphasis. And in this area, we want to highlight what is the desired object. And we want to make sure that the desired object is the center of interest for our design. So when you look at this graphic here, what do you see first? And most people say that they see the trunks of the trees first. They're really in the foreground, they're real black, they're bold, they stick out. If our purpose of this design was to highlight the house, we really didn't do a very good job, because that's really not the focus of this particular graphic here. So when we're putting things together, we want to really think about, what do we want people to see first? You know, sometimes when we design graphics, when we design things, people only see them for a split second. And so we want to make sure that what they see in that split second is really the main point that we want to get across. And more importantly, we want it to be interesting enough that it grabs their attention, that they look at it further. We want them to spend time looking at our graphic, because that's how we're really going to get our message across. So we always want to come back is, what is the emphasis, and make sure that we use some of those elements and principles to make that emphasis appear. Overall, our goal in the elements and principles of design is unity. Unity is really the goal of the design, and that unity is achieved when all parts of a design look as if they belong together. When we do a design, we want to make sure that things flow well, that they look nice, that they look relatable, that they're balanced in proportion, and they look good together. If something is really abstract, way out there, it doesn't seem like it flows, that just doesn't really give a good feeling in terms of when somebody looks at that particular design. So the goal here is going for unity in how we put everything together. So let's look at a couple examples here. We're going to start with the architectural world and look at the design of the house. So basically, anything that we see in terms of a design or a creation, we can take and we can evaluate it based on the elements and principles of design. So here we can look at the structure and say, okay, well, what colors do we see? Well, certainly we see a lot of of soft gray colors, but then there's also certainly this bold red color. And again, that red kind of signifies an energy, a power, a passion to it. And then we also have some brown colors here as well. Lines, when we think about the lines, there really are a lot of lines in this structure. We have lines, we have horizontal lines from the garage door to the siding. We have really some variety of lines going on in the gate here. We have a nice big curved line up here. We have some diagonal lines going with the roof. So we really have a lot of different lines going on. When you come back to think about what those mean, again, the diagonal lines kind of add interest, where at the same time our curved lines add a kind of a soft and welcoming feel, which in this case, going right over the opening of the entrance for this building, that's a good place to put a curved line, because you want people to, when it comes to the entrance of a structure, you want them to feel welcome, you want them to feel open and invited in, and so that's a good way to use lines there. Shapes, we have a variety of shapes from rectangles and triangles and different shapes that are incorporated here. And then lastly, texture. We really have a variety of texture also, where this up here seems fairly smooth, but down here with this kind of stone pad and stone wall here, there's really kind of a rough texture with there. So I've used a lot of different textures. Going into principles of design, we can start with looking at are things in proportion, and that's kind of hard to see here. It's kind of a close-up shot, but in this case, maybe this pad here is kind of large, but I would say things are still in proportion to one another. We look at balance. Does it have a formal or informal balance? And from what we can see here, it's not exactly the same on both sides, but yet I would say things are still balanced, and so it's an informal balance. Rhythm, what patterns do you see? Well, we see patterns in the siding, the garage door, the gates. There are really a lot of different patterns in places where things are flowing. And then lastly, the emphasis. In this particular structure, and again, it's kind of a close-up shot here, but I think if you were to step back and look at it as a whole, I think the emphasis would certainly be in this entrance area, which is really important. A lot of houses, the garage is on the front of the house just because that's where the street is. There's not an alley on the side or the back, and so a lot of times, that garage is right there in front. Well, that's not typically the best visually thing that you want people to see first, but that's really what's the biggest and stuck out the most is that garage. So when we have to design a house that way, we really want to think about what are some things we can do to get that emphasis, that initial focus off of the garage in order and over towards the entrance. And here, and yes, this is a little bit innovative, it's a little bit creative and out there, but they've really done a lot of things to try to draw your eyes over, and I think they've done the job well, where we've used some bright colors, we used a curve up here and some different components in the steps to really say, this is where I want you to focus. And so they've really done well at incorporating the elements and principles of design for this house structure. Another example you can see here quickly, here's a design for a structure, and you can see again we have some diagonal lines here that are adding that interest, but then we also have this curved line down here. Again, that's a great place to put above your entrance. You want people, yes, they're seeing this diagonal line, and that's really kind of exciting and drawing some interest to it, but at the same time we also want people to feel welcome and invited, so we can put kind of a curved awning over the front door to really invite people there. And the last one I want to look at here is a graphic from Diablo Tools, and here they're advertising their Sawzall blades. But you can see, color. Right from the get-go, they've used a red color. Again, that's a passionate color. It's an energetic color. When you think about a Sawzall, it's got a lot of energy. It's got a lot of power to it. Red is an appropriate color. You wouldn't necessarily want to use a blue or green. When you're thinking about a Sawzall, you're not thinking calm and cool and those types of things. So red is certainly an appropriate color. Another thing I wanted to highlight here in this graphic is their use of here on the curved line. In this case, it does a nice job of drawing your attention to the Sawzall blade. It kind of creates a nice little frame here and highlighting that blade there. I'm not going to go through all the different areas, but you could still break it down based on the shapes that you see, the texture. We have kind of a rough texture with this pipe here. And when you think about a Sawzall blade and cutting things, that's a rough thing. And so you're looking for something that's going to be strong, have a lot of strength to it. And so we could look at it and talk about the proportion, the balance of it. But the main last thing I wanted to highlight here is the emphasis. And I think they've done a good job of using color in terms of its emphasis, really standing out, letting the blade stand out. Again, have the curved line that kind of draws your eye over to that blade. So I think they've done a good job here of really, what are they trying to emphasize and what can we do to make sure that that's what people see. I guess the other thing to highlight here quick is also on proportion. This blade here is pretty clearly photoshopped into where the actual Sawzall is. This is not how the actual picture was taken. And so it was important for them to make sure that the size of this Sawzall blade matched the size of the Sawzall. It should be in proportion to each other, and I think they've done a good job with that. So overall, we have the elements and principles of design, and we can use the elements and principles to make sure that when we come up with a design that we're really doing what we want. Again, to come back to, we're creating the intended message, the best message possible for our intended audience. And so it's important anytime you do a design is to think about how the elements work together, and are we following those principles in order to make a good design. And so I really would encourage you to begin thinking about those things as you go along your day, that you see a graphic, that you see a design, that you see a structure. Take a second to evaluate that based on the elements and principles of design. Because again, being able to train your mind to do those things is going to help you in the future when you're doing your own design.